Abraham Lincoln warned that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Would you like to know what's being taught in today's classrooms? Welcome to Say What? With attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. They'll explore the issues facing children, parents, and society as a result of the public schools and the forces behind them. Say What is the radio program of Protect Our Kids, which seeks to inform and equip concerned citizens about the looming crisis in American education. So listen in as your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr., unpack the issues and organizations affecting our children. And now here's your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr.
Hello everyone, I'm George Rosca.
I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 163 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the horrific social contagion that's seducing girls in the Western world into identifying as trans.
That's right, George. We've covered this topic in many of our prior episodes about rapid onset gender dysphoria and the claims of trans activists, including medical professionals. However, George, in April of this year, a very important study was released to the public that we're hoping could be a sort of tipping point in the conversation about what is in the best interest of people suffering from gender dysphoria.
So parents, if you go back to some of our previous episodes, we've dedicated a couple of them on specifically diving into the studies. What do the studies say? There have been multiple meta-analyses that have been conducted by very reputable organizations, including an organization called the Institute for Research and Evaluation. One of those very popular studies basically boiled down to here's 5 things that parents should know. In what is called now the CASS report that's coming out of England, they have published, and this is basically another one of those meta-analyses. This is the largest review ever undertaken in the field of transgender health. It was led by Dr. Hilary Cass, which is a former president of the UK's Royal College of Pediatrics. And it was actually commissioned by Britain's National Health Services. So you'll hear us use this acronym over and over, NHS. That's National Health Service, with the stated goal of figuring out how best to help the growing number of children and young people who are looking for support from the NHS in relation to their gender identity. So at the root of this report is basically the question, are we doing the right thing by continuing with gender-affirming care model as opposed to, the reality model of biology? So, we've talked about gender-affirming care over and over in many of our past episodes as well. But the CASS report, and I hope that you will remember this title from here on out, the CASS report is a 388-page report which took 4 years to develop and to work through that meta-analysis of all of these past studies. And The Economist puts it this way: it's damning of practices that were commonplace in England until recently and remain widespread in other countries, notably in America. And note how they point America out, because America has gone all in on this bandwagon of gender-affirming care, and we'll see why this has been a very, very horrific thing to do. In fact, the CASS report, up in its first 10, 15 pages, has a kind of a summary, an executive summary section, which really helps us to understand what their recommendations are. There are 32 recommendations that are categorized by areas really of utmost importance. They're looking at things like assessing, previous studies. What have the diagnosis been on all of these patients? What are the care plans that have been, utilized? What are the psychological interventions and many other categories? But for the sake of our discussion here, parents, we've boiled this down with the help of many different other reviewers that have helped us, that have published their reviews of the CASS report, and it's basically discrediting 4 widely believed claims, Mark.
Yeah, and those 4, starting with the first one, is that adolescent gender dysphoria does not predict lifelong experience. Let me read that again. Adolescent gender dysphoria does not predict lifelong experience. Number 2, puberty blockers don't merely buy time to think, and we'll get into more detail about what these means. Third, that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are not life-saving medicine. Fourth, that the exponential rise in trans identity in recent years is not explained by greater societal acceptance. And finally, George, it will suggest how the CASS report might help all of us, hopefully medical professionals, in conversations, especially with those with whom we deeply disagree on questions of trans identity.
And that conclusion, Mark, for me was so important because every time you talk about this topic, even in front of school boards, and we've mentioned this over and over, everybody becomes like hysterical. They start shouting you down like this is a holy grail that's untouchable. And so hopefully this report will be a huge tipping point internationally on bringing back the much needed dialogue and sanity in these conversations. So let's start dissecting each one of these. Number one, adolescent gender dysphoria does not predict adult identification. So trans identity is often presented as an innate reality, which must not be questioned. In fact, the only time that somebody ever gets questioned about their trans or queer identity is if they detransition.
Question that means you're transphobic. You must not do that, including parents.
Exactly. So what's really crazy going back to their worldview is that you could be, queer. You could be questioning. Those are all categories. But it's funny how the only one thing you cannot question is if you want to change back to the heteronormative state. So the claims is that children or adolescents who experience gender dysphoria simply are trans and must therefore be allowed to make decisions on that basis. But according to the CASS report, gender dysphoria in childhood is not reliably predictive of whether that young person will have long-standing gender incongruence in the future or whether medical interventions will be the best option for them. And this is a quote from page 29. Indeed, far from gender dysphoria in minors reflecting an immutable reality, the large majority of people who experience it in childhood or adolescence will no longer do so in adulthood. And we have been saying this thing
for years,
over and over. As CASS reports, a review of studies, quote, found persistence rates of 10 to 33% in cohorts who had met formal diagnostic criteria at initial assessment, end quote. This is from page 67. So in other words, at least 2/3 of those who reported gender dysphoria as children no longer experienced it in childhood. Most grew up to be same-sex attracted adults who identified with their biological sex. And this is in line with much secular academic research. And the CASS report uses the term here, same-sex attracted. But this is very interesting because over and over, we've been talking about this where, the CASS report is really trying to give the benefit of the doubt to all of these studies that they are reviewing. And at worst, only 1/3 of these prepubescent kids or adolescent kids ever continue questioning their identity, their biological identity. So this is something for us as parents. This is a huge data point for us to take home. The CASS report backs all of this up. And if you need to use this data, especially in your next little 3-minute speech in front of your school board as you're probably trying to pass certain policies, parents, please do so. So, Mark, how about the second one?
Second one is that puberty blockers don't merely buy time to think. Now, puberty blockers are routinely prescribed, George, as we know, to adolescents on the grounds that they just press pause on sexual development and buy young people, quote, time to think. Now, this claim is made in middle school health classes across America today, but as the CASS report notes, quote, there is no evidence that puberty blockers buy time to think and some concern that they may change the trajectory of psychosexual and gender identity development. Strikingly, the report says, the vast majority of young people started on puberty blockers proceed from these puberty blockers to masculinizing or feminizing hormones. Furthermore, puberty blockers may negatively affect important physical aspects such as cognitive development and fertility. George, we've been talking about this again for years. The CASS report has looked into incredible numbers of studies to validate now these findings. So why are these drugs so widely prescribed? Well, according to the CASS report, it goes back to 2011, because in 2011, a team of Dutch scientists published a study of 70 patients who had received early treatment with puberty blockers between the years 2000 and 2008. In fact, the minimum age for inclusion into that study was you had to be 12 years old. Kids had to have suffered from lifelong gender dysphoria that had increased around puberty and be psychologically stable. In other words, without serious comorbid psychiatric disorders that might interfere with the diagnostic process, and have family support. But given the poor mental health outcomes for adult transgender population, much of which was attributed to minority stress and difficulty passing along their expressed gender, the logic was that prescribing puberty blockers to prepubescent and adolescent kids would enable them to live more successfully in adulthood, since they would ultimately look more like the sex that they were trying to identify with. Since taking puberty blockers was seen as simply pressing pause, the rationale was also that prescribing them would give young people, quote, time to think before making a high-stakes decision about going on to cross-sex hormones. Well, George, the same year that the Dutch study was published, a UK-based study started trialing the use of puberty blockers on kids who reported gender dysphoria. Preliminary results from the study from 2015 to 16 did not demonstrate this benefit. Rather than just being a neutral step, the trial found that 98% of kids who were prescribed puberty blockers would go on to take cross-sex hormones, which, George, basically is all of them, right, for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, and this is very important, parents, because what you have here is side by side in two separate countries around the same time. The Dutch and the English, they're doing a study trying, to be very careful with how they're controlling every factor, right? And especially the factors of comorbidities when it comes to psychiatric issues, right? Because you want to take away any other possibility of causing this gender incongruence or dysphoria in a child. And these studies did not replicate the same results. However, when you have a certain ideology, what are you going to do? You're going to take a study that matches your ideology. And so the LGBTQ movement took the Dutch study and they ran with it. And so in the English studies, they could not replicate this. So meanwhile, on the basis of what became known as the Dutch protocol from 2014 onwards, in Europe and America, puberty blockers were routinely prescribed to kids, even though many of them would not have met the inclusion criteria of the original protocol. So one of those big ones that we were just mentioning was those mental health comorbidities. You talk about most kids that are on puberty blockers in America today have some kind of a on the spectrum designation. And that would have not even been allowed for them to be included, even in the Dutch study. So this is where, all of these details are lost on the general public. It's easy for, the Human Rights Campaign or CASS or Planned Parenthood to come out and just rah-rah saying, the Dutch have done their studies and this is why we need to use puberty blockers. But nobody ever gets into these kind of details. And so parents, this is so important for us to understand. Advocates for prescribing puberty blockers claim they ease gender dysphoria and improve body image and psychological well-being, but the systematic review of literature on which the CASS report draws found no evidence that puberty blockers improve body image or dysphoria, and very limited evidence for positive mental health outcomes, which without a control group could be due to placebo effect or concomitant psychological support. It also found that bone density is compromised during puberty suppression, and that there was insufficient or inconsistent evidence about the effects of puberty suppression on psychological or psychosocial well-being, cognitive development, cardiometabolic risk, or even infertility. And Mark, we talked about a very special case here in America with Chloe Cole, and the horrors of what this young girl, had to go through, which we were all hoping and praying for this time to come, right? For something like the CASS report to come. And sure enough, it's the year 2024, and we finally have something like the CASS report. So in light of the potential risks regarding a range of health outcomes, the UK's National Health Services was advised in July 2023 that puberty blockers should only be offered to minors participating in scientific research.
Yeah, not as a means of treatment per se, but scientific research. This is an incredibly dramatic step, and thank God the step has been taken. The UK became the 5th European country or region to halt its use of puberty blockers for trans-identifying youth outside of a very controlled scientific studies. Here in the U.S., George, we have what is called a split screen system, quite unlike the European nation. In fact, 23 red states have passed laws, bans of pediatric access to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for gender distress. Many of these are tied up in the courts, and the Supreme Court is probably, at the end of the day, going to have to settle this matter, while the blue states, mostly the coastal states, support liberal access and continue to these medicines. In fact, so wide is the gulf between the CASS report and other trans health organizations, most notably what's called WPATH. We've talked about that many times, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that after CASS supported forbidding puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to minors, WPATH said that the majority of gender dysphoric adolescents would fare better on such medications than with the holistic mental health care CAP advises, and that is now policy in England.
And Mark, I want to read exactly what WPATH responded to the CASS report. They published a statement April 12th, 2024. In response to publication of the CASS report, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, and affiliated partners, ATHI, OzPath, PATHA, and USPath, issued the following statement. WPATH supports policies that increase access to high-quality ethical care for transgender youth. The foundation of the CASS report is rooted in the false premise that non-medical alternatives to care will result in less adolescent distress for most adolescents and is based on a lack of knowledge and of experience working with this patient population. I mean, this is crazy. Even after the CASS report has tried to take this, meta-analysis of all the studies out there. Again, WPATH, which is ideologically driven, wants to only take whatever studies support their ideology, and they don't want to look at it collectively and saying, can this be replicated? And if it can't, then there is something else going on here. So this is what we're up against. These are the first two major points that we really wanted to touch base upon in this episode. And so we're going to continue on with our next episode. So Mark, this is all the time we have for today, but where can parents find more about what we do and what POK is all about?
Well, you can go to our website, pok.org, and we just have a wealth of information about this issue and many others on that website. And you can listen to this podcast, Say What, under Protect Our Kids. It is found on most podcast distributors. So we hope you'll take the time to do that, and we look forward to talking to you in part 2 of this very important analysis of what the CASS report is showing in our next episode. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Say What, the radio ministry of Protect Our Kids, where they seek to inform and equip concerned citizens about the crisis in American public education and the forces working against our children. Join us at this same time every Saturday as attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. unpack the issues so that we can better safeguard our nation's children. For more information about this program or Protect Our Kids, email the show at info@protectourkidsnow.org. That's info@protectourkidsnow.org. And join Mark and George right here next week at this same time for another episode of Say What.